That, of course, is the Roland tape, but great use there. In 1983, Lee Scratch Perry's years at the Black Ark came to an end. This is his mixing console. He burned down his own studio. He had a completely insane dream where he felt like he was possessed by the devil. He said that there were simply too many ghosts inside the studio. He reappeared several years later in Zurich, Switzerland, married to the madam of the most expensive house of prostitution in Zurich. She retired. He continues to make albums as a singer, but he never touches a mixing board. I mean, it's obvious what I'm trying to say with this. You know, dub's influence in music today is massive. I mean, it's a quick and easy line of influence from dub to hip hop, from hip hop to electronica, dub directly to electronica. The hottest electronic music in London right now is dubstep. I mean, this is really relevant music to what's happening right now. Rock bands from The Clash, The Kills have been influenced by dub reggae. The Clash even worked with Lee Scratch Perry at one point. But today's dub music is obviously done with today's production tools. So, you know, I guess what I'm getting at is what can we learn from these original masters? Why are we even talking about them? It's not simply a historical point, obviously. For me, it's really 2 points. Less is very often more. What we take away from songs can be absolutely as important as what we add. Too often we just do, but there is a great power to undoing. Space and silence are an absolute powerful dynamic in music, an overlooked dynamic. We're always thinking we have to build things up, but actually sometimes the best thing is to, like Lee Scratch Perry, blow up your studio and, you know, take things away. You know, there's a lot to be learned from these guys' experiments. They are not dated. They are not museum pieces. The second major point is the means of production are not as important as our ideas. That's really what it comes down to. Gear is absolutely not the answer. Tools without ideas are absolutely meaningless. Our collection of plugins are infinitely more powerful than what these guys have at their disposal, but by no means is the music we're making now producing much more revolutionary results. You know, it's maybe more interesting to us because it's of our time and things like that. But you know, if you listen to the soundscapes these guys are making, admittedly, you know, they sound a little lo-fi by today's audio standards and things like that. But the imagination of how they're working with the limited materials they have, you know, is really, really amazing. So I guess ultimately the point is a few well-chosen tools that you know how to work with will almost always be more valuable than just endless, infinite possibilities. The next person I'm going to talk about is Brian Eno. This is Brian Eno in 1972 when he played with Roxy Music. He looks rather different now. Much less hair, for example. Since the late 70s when Brian Eno started to produce albums for other artists, he has worked with an amazing array of bands, including the Talking Heads, David Bowie, Paul Simon, Coldplay, and is he probably best known for his long-term association with the superstar Irish band U2. He has also done countless experimental solo albums and collaborations, and despite his rather unorthodox production and musical ideas, Eno is undisputably one of the most successful musical producers of modern time. If your parents ever tell you you will never make money doing art, show them this picture of Brian Eno. This guy is absolutely loaded. He is rich. And he made mostly experimental music besides his obvious, let's say, raucous outings with U2 and Coldplay and others. One important thing about Eno is that he neither considers himself a traditional musician or a producer. He hates both of these terms. He claims that he doesn't play any instruments, although his musical contributions are all over the albums he records under his own names, and or the artist that he produces. He thinks of himself more as a creator of possibilities, a provocateur, someone who turns common ideas upside down. I had the amazing opportunity to work with Brian Eno one evening. He came to a studio that I was working in Seattle with my band, The Walkabouts. It was just an absolute chance meeting. The guy he was traveling with knew the guy that was producing our album, and they came and stopped by. He did actually end up playing on the record that I was making because we we fed him with a lot of beer, and he likes to talk, and we were a faithful audience for 2 or 3 hours listening to him talk, and I think at that point he felt obligated to do something. But even when he was working, I was really fascinated, even in this really limited view that I had of his work. He kept calling it a study in what could be done. He was never saying, this is what we're doing. He was always like, well, this is another study of what we could do. All the time he's recording, but he's always keeping it very provisional. It's always very like undefined. Are we really working, or are we just having fun, or are we experimenting? Are we doing something serious, or does any of that really matter? He was printing effects immediately. I mean, back in those days, it was always like, you don't, you know, if you're using a delay, you keep it on the delay return. You know, you don't actually print it to the tape. Eno was always committed to printing effects as you go. It's like this take no prisoners, don't look back, you know, approach. You have to keep moving forward. You have to trust your intuitions at the time. He actually celebrates his own technical and musical incompetence. He makes a big point about this. He is committed to engaging with music in an intuitive, sensual way that puts little or no weight in the traditional ideas of engineering excellence, trained musicianship, highly developed songwriting, or group performance. He actually really seems to care about none of this. Eno sees the studio as not as a place to bring in pre-written material, but rather as a place to compose. Which again, in electronic music doesn't sound very radical, but with working with rock bands, it's really radical. When you have YouTube, you know, paying you whatever, thousands of euros a day to be working with them, and you've told them deliberately not to have any songs, you know, it becomes a little bit more interesting than, of course, you know, all of us that make electronic music, we sit there and we fool around and we kind of improvise as we go. But I mean, you usually don't rent, you know, a 2,000 euro a day studio with filled to the brim with everything possible to do that. But that is Eno's philosophy, and he's had great success with it. This is him in his home studio in the early 70s, again when he had some hair. And then that's him in his studio in London, probably in the 1990s. I'm going to read just a little thing. Eno actually gave a lecture in the late 70s to a recording school that he called it. The name of it was The Studio as a Compositional Tool. And he said, at this point, again, this doesn't seem so radical now, but at the time it was very radical. He says, you no longer come to the studio with a conception of a finished piece. Instead, you come with actually a bare skeleton of the piece, or perhaps no starting point at all. Once you become familiar with studio facilities, or even if you're not, actually you begin to compose in relation to those facilities. You begin to think in terms of putting something on, putting something else on, trying this on top, and so on. And taking some of the original stuff off, or taking a mixture of things off, and seeing what you're left with. You actually start constructing things in the studio. Each thing you add modifies the whole set of things that went before, and you suddenly find yourself at a place you couldn't possibly have conceived of, a place that's strange and curious to you. The sense of mystery, learning to live with it, and make use of it is extremely important. He was very much, it remains to be very much into chance operations. So you can see the slide here, I actually have these. He developed a set of cards in the late 70s called oblique strategies. He did this with a friend of his called Peter Schmidt. Essentially, oblique strategies is for when, you know, the guitar player shows up at the session too drunk, or you know the machinery is not working. You know your sampler dumped all your samples, or you know whatever. And you don't really know what to do. So you pull a card out of the deck. Okay, this is a great one, and you let this inform your next move. So this one says, look closely at the most embarrassing details, and then amplify them. Not something we normally do. And some of them are quite good. This one's just carry on. This one's good too. Discover the recipes you are using and then abandon them. I like this one. Slow preparation, fast execution. And so on. And a lot of these cards are actually contradictions. I mean, it's not a cohesive philosophy inside of it. In fact, it's the opposite. You know, one will tell you to do things fast, one will tell you to do things slow, one will tell you to go home, one will tell you to stay there all night. You know, it's a completely, just, excuse the French, just to fuck with your situation. You know, it's just a way to just actually push you to try out different things. One of actually Eno's major musical innovations as an artist was the creation of what is called ambient music. Given his belief in chance as a compositional tool, it is not a surprise that Eno developed his ideas for ambient music from a chance encounter he had while he was getting well at home after he got hit by a car, actually. And I'll just read a little bit about that. In London, Brian Eno was walking home from a recording session in 1975 when an odd thought popped into his head. If that song was the last thing I ever recorded, would I mind having that as my final piece of work? He continued to walk. 100 yards later, he slipped on the rain-soaked sidewalk and tumbled into the street. He tried to get back to the sidewalk, and then a taxi hit him at about 60 kilometers an hour, running over his legs and snapping his head back. Eno convalesced in the hospital, lucky to be alive. He eventually went home. One rainy afternoon, Eno hobbled over to his turntable and dropped a needle on a record of 18th century harp music. Exhausted, he barely got enough energy to collapse back into the bed. As the record started, it became apparent that only one speaker was working, and that the volume was very low, actually too low to really be heard over the falling rain. Too weak to get up and increase the volume, he began to drift into a bleary, lent sleep. As the record played on, he drifted off, and something strange happened. When the louder notes were audible, the rainstorm actually obscured the quieter passages. And the two sounds, the rain and the harp music, tend to go together in an atmospheric whole. Eno says, this presented what was for me a new way of hearing music. As part of the ambience of the environment, just as the color of the light and the sound of the rain were parts of the ambience. He also had a training in philosophy, but let's listen to some of what this means in real terms. This is from Ambient 1, the first ambient record that he did.